You just told someone you'd never do that to them. You meant it. Your voice was steady. Your chest felt tight in the way it does when a promise really matters. But somewhere in your genes is a species that didn't make that promise for most of its existence. Not because it lacked love, because it lacked the one thing that made the promise necessary. Here's the strange part. The real answer isn't about willpower. It isn't about character. It's about farming. Start with what you assume. You probably assume that pairing off with one partner for life is the natural human default, and that anything else is a deviation from it. Anthropologists call this the naturalistic assumption, and it shows up everywhere, from wedding vows to divorce court. But when researchers actually looked at the historical and cross-cultural record, the picture that emerged was far messier than that. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy spent decades studying primate mothers and infant care, and her work pointed to something uncomfortable. Early human child rearing likely depended on more than one adult male being invested in a child's survival. This is called cooperative breeding. Human infants are helpless for years. A single provider, working alone, would have struggled to keep a child alive through droughts, injuries, and long winters. So many early human groups appear to have spread caregiving and resources across multiple partners and multiple potential fathers, not just one. That doesn't sound like a love story. It sounds like a survival strategy. And for most of human history, those were the same thing. Now here's where it gets stranger. Evolutionary biologist Christopher Ryan and physician Cacilda Jethá spent years compiling evidence from primatology, anatomy, and hunter-gatherer societies. They found something your body has been carrying quietly this whole time. Human testicle size, relative to body weight, sits between two extremes. Gorillas, who rarely compete for mates, have tiny testicles. Chimpanzees, whose females mate with multiple males in short windows, have enormous ones. Humans sit in the middle. Not chimp. Not gorilla. Something else. What does that mean? It means your anatomy isn't built for a species with a long, uncontested history of strict pair bonding. It's built for something in between. A species doing both, sometimes pairing off, sometimes not. Depending on where, depending on when. Think about that for a second. Your body is a historical record. It just doesn't speak in words. So if flexible pairing was normal, what changed? Around 10,000 years ago, something happened that reorganized nearly every human relationship on Earth. Agriculture. Before farming, most humans lived as foragers. Anthropological surveys of foraging societies, including the influential cross-cultural work compiled by researcher George Murdoch, found enormous variation in how people paired off. Some groups were strictly monogamous. Others allowed multiple partners. Many had loose, shifting arrangements where children were raised collectively, and paternity wasn't the organizing principle of the group. Resources were shared. Land wasn't owned. There was often nothing to inherit, so there was nothing to protect through strict lineage. Then people started planting seeds instead of following herds. And everything about ownership changed. Once you can grow a fixed plot of land, that land becomes valuable. Once it's valuable, someone needs to inherit it. Once someone needs to inherit it, you need to know, with certainty, whose child is whose. Suddenly, paternity wasn't just a biological fact. It became an economic one. This is the argument put forward by scholars studying the transition from foraging to farming, including work building on Friedrich Engels' early theories and later refined by modern behavioral scientists. Strict monogamy, or at least the strong social enforcement of it, expanded dramatically alongside private property, inherited wealth, and fixed settlements. Not because people suddenly discovered a purer form of love, because controlling reproduction became the only way to control who got the land when you died. Pause on that. The wedding ring, the promise, the entire architecture of forsaking all others, may have less to do with your heart than with your ancestors' harvest. That reframes almost everything about how you experience jealousy. Today, jealousy feels ancient. It feels like it comes from somewhere deep and unshakable. And in a sense, it does. But the specific shape it takes, the intensity with which many societies punish infidelity, the legal and religious systems built entirely around policing sexual exclusivity, those systems track much more closely with the rise of agriculture and property than with some fixed evolutionary blueprint for lifelong pairing. Psychologist David Buss has spent his career studying jealousy across cultures, and his research shows it does have deep evolutionary roots tied to paternity uncertainty and resource protection. But the research also shows enormous cultural variation in how that underlying wiring gets expressed. Wiring is not the same as a rulebook. Your brain evolved a smoke detector. Culture decided how loud the alarm should be, and what counts as fire. So where does that leave the idea of romantic love itself? Here's the part that might surprise you the most. The intense, singular, "you are my one and only version of romantic love" that dominates modern movies and modern marriage is, in its current cultural form, relatively recent. The dopamine-driven craving for a specific person are ancient and appear across cultures worldwide. That part is real. That part is old. But the expectation that this feeling should be permanent, exclusive, and the sole foundation for a lifelong household is a much newer cultural overlay on top of very old wiring. You inherited the wiring. You were handed the rulebook separately. So does that mean monogamy is fake? No, that's the wrong question entirely. The honest answer is that monogamy is real, cheating is real, love is real, and none of them are as simple as natural or unnatural. Your capacity for deep attachment to one person is genuinely ancient. Your body's mixed anatomical signals suggest flexibility was always part of the plan too. And the strict social enforcement around fidelity that feels like eternal moral law is, historically speaking, tied tightly to when humans started owning dirt. Which brings you back to that promise you made. The one that felt so certain in your chest. It's not fake because it's cultural. Nothing important stops being real just because you can trace where it came from. But maybe it helps to know what you're actually promising. Not obedience to some ancient, unbreakable law written into your cells. A choice made new by two people in a world your ancestors never lived in. Where children can survive without 10 cooperating adults. Where land isn't the only form of security. Where paternity can be confirmed with a swab instead of enforced with a threat. The alarm system in your chest is old. But the wiring that makes you capable of choosing one person again and again on purpose every single day might be the newer, stranger, more remarkable part of the story. You didn't inherit a rule. You inherited a choice. And every time you keep that promise, you're doing something your farming ancestors needed, enforced by fear, and doing it instead by will. That's not older than you think. That's newer. And it might be the most human thing about you.